Hey, I'm Mo for YouTube videos. I am a feminist and a lesbian, and I make conversational commentary videos about both of those things. This video is actually a follow-up to my video from last month about the Neil Gaiman Allegation podcast and my observations about that. Something is loud. I don't know if you can hear that. If you haven't already seen that one, it's about an hour long. You should probably go check it out just for the sake of being informed for this one. I want to start with my usual content warning for coercive control, abuse, sexual assault, my typical victim justice politics here on this channel. If this video doesn't feel like a safe or comfortable topic for you to watch right now, that's totally fine. It'll still be here another time when it's something that you are comfortable engaging with. And before we move into the additional allegations against Neil Gaiman that have surfaced, I do have a few corrections to make from my last video. So first of all, while I do still mostly stand by my Amanda Palmer apologetics in that one, I said Amanda did not respond to the message from Scarlett's friend. That's not true. That was just my own note-taking failure. Amanda Palmer did respond to the text from Scarlett's friend that, summarized Neil Gaiman's abuse of her. Amanda's response still, to me, doesn't seem to imply prior knowledge of 14 abuse victims. I still don't think that it really counteracts a lot of what I'm saying, but the part where I said if Amanda responded, it would have been in the podcast, yeah, it was in the podcast. I just did not take good notes on that one part. That's on me. Thank you so much for the commenters who let me know that I was wrong about that. Again, this might be me taking bad notes because I am a little bit less critical of Amanda Palmer than I should be. I don't believe any of the new allegations are coming from people who have similar stories of coming forward to Scarlett. I think Scarlett is the only one so far who has told Amanda Palmer her story of being sexually assaulted by Neil. I still, again, I hold space for the fact that Amanda Palmer did not respond maybe the way that she should have or in the way that would have been best, but obviously, though, I do still hold space for people who disagreed with me on that and who think that Amanda should have responded to all of that differently. I also confused which of Alice Munro's parents was a bookseller / owned the bookstore. So when I said that there was a bookstore that carries her mother's name that released a statement, that is her biological father's bookstore, not her stepfather's bookstore. I learned a lot more about Alice Munro than I had previously known, so I, again, just wrote something down wrong and appreciate being corrected. You can also find a really excellent pinned comment on that video that explains in a lot greater understanding than I originally had why the podcast spent time discussing Neil Gaiman's family ties to Scientology. That's absolutely worth reading. I pinned it as soon as I read it and highly recommend that you read as well. I feel a responsibility to try to get as much of what I'm saying correct in my videos as I can, but I do sometimes make mistakes, and I appreciate being told kindly when I do. There were already notes in the description about this, but it still felt worth noting because I assume a lot of people who watched the video did not go back and read the description a week later when I put in updates to it. But even with all of that out of the way, it's not as long of an intro as we had last time, so let's get into it. In this video, I mostly will be talking about the Tortoise podcast, but there also was an episode of a podcast called Am I Broken? Survivor Stories that was recently released and that has more allegations against Neil Gaiman. This set of allegations is brought forward by somebody using a pseudonym. I have no prior experience with this podcast. I immediately trusted it more than I trusted the Tortoise one because the podcast host introduced themselves with they, them pronouns, and that made me be like, okay, good, this isn't a TERF thing. They describe both in the podcast and in the description for the podcast, which I can put on screen. They had initially spoken in 2022, and then the survivor, who's going by the pseudonym of Claire, didn't feel like she was ready to come forward. She said that she would come forward when other women told their stories, and then other women told their stories. She reached out, they spoke again, the podcast episode came out. I can recommend this episode of this podcast a lot more comfortably than I can recommend going and listening to the Tortoise one, so I'm gonna do that. I'm not going to go back over every single detail of the allegations for reasons that have been gone over in my first video in this series, and also just I think you should go listen to this podcast and support this podcast. I like the way that it was handled. I also don't really feel like I want to summarize something that includes parts of somebody's therapy session. I think the way that it was presented there is good, and I don't need to continue to, like, telephone game that, right? So you can go find it linked in the description below. But just know, as we're talking about the things that come up in the new episode of the Tortoise podcast, there is also another story of somebody else who came forward and talked about being coerced and assaulted by Neil Gaiman as, like, a young fan right at the same age as Scarlett and Kay both were at the time of their allegations against Gaiman. She was a fan of Neil's. She met him at a signing. It is a really similar story to what we've already heard. It does not surprise me at all that she felt a desire to come forward if she had already said she wanted to, if anybody else did, and then the stories that did come forward were so similar to her own. She does feel like she's coming from a place of, like, pretty healed solidarity from what I listened to. Again, just, you should go listen to that one yourself if you're interested in knowing the details about this kind of situation, and if that would be triggering to you, probably don't, because this podcast is extremely in-depth, though it is, like, a lot more sensitive than I found the Tortoise one to be. It does absolutely serve to prove the pattern that is laid out in the Tortoise podcast, and, you know, now we have to start talking about the Tortoise podcast again, so let's do that. Similarly to how the Am I Broken podcast episode came about, this 5th episode of the Tortoise podcast starts with saying that in July of this year, after having heard the allegations laid out in the initial 4 episodes, a woman emailed her lawyer. We can hear her reading that email out loud as our introduction to her, and she's saying that she feels like she hasn't done enough to prevent Neil Gaiman from victimizing other people. She says she has questions, that she wants to know if she's allowed to support the other victims who have come forward, and asks her lawyer exactly what the NDA she signed prevents her from doing. She also mentions that even though she was compensated, the episode in her life involving Neil has had lasting traumatic effects on her. Paul reminds us that Scarlett, one of Gaiman's initial accusers from the first batch of episodes, also had signed an NDA, and we hear part of the language that was used in the NDA. Paul says that in this story, the NDA is one of the only things in black and white compared to all of the other shades of gray. And also, apparently, speaking about Neil or Amanda or any of his agents or anyone on his team was all, like, included in this gag order that this new woman was asked to sign and did sign. This new accuser identifies herself with both her first and last name in the podcast. You may remember from the first set of episodes, we had Scarlett, and she did not use her last name, and then Kay used only her first initial. Obviously, I have absolutely nothing but respect for people who don't want to put their full name out there. I think that's fine, especially when you're coming out with allegations against somebody famous. But also, like, you know, credit to Caroline for being brave. Caroline's story goes like this, and you can find the write-up for it linked in the description below. She and her 3 children lived on Gaiman's property for 7 years. Part of that time, her husband lived with her. Part of it, he didn't, because they split up. The NDA she was asked to sign covers the entire length of time. We're given Neil Gaiman's position, which I'm kind of still unsure of how they got. Council of Geeks got more into this in her video than I did. I think that video that she made is absolutely worth a watch. I really enjoyed seeing somebody else's thoughts on this after I had been kind of listening to it in isolation to make my own video, and then also especially after having so many amazing conversations in the comment section of my first video. But Council of Geeks video is really good, and also spent more time laying out. I kind of assumed that I was like, okay, maybe I just don't understand how true crime stuff presents this, but yes, Council of Geeks gets more into this than I did in my video. Basically, every time that they say something that is Neil Gaiman's response, they say, oh, Neil Gaiman's position is X, or we understand Neil Gaiman's position to be X. And, like, I would just like to know if it was a letter from a publicist, or, like, you know, how these things come about. Sometimes it's a lot more specific than other times. I still don't have an answer. I've listened to the rest of the podcast. I don't have an answer. But still, we're told in that roundabout way in the narration that Neil Gaiman's position is that he vehemently disputes Caroline's allegations of repeated sexual abuse, and that he settled with her to avoid protracted and expensive litigation. His position is that an NDA was necessary because the allegations against him would have been used for adverse media publicity. And, like, I just don't think that there's almost ever a really good reason to ask somebody to sign an NDA, especially not when there is anything that remotely could be construed as assault or a breaking of sexual boundaries. Like, I feel like it makes you look extremely bad when you ask somebody to sign an NDA. I think it looks a lot worse for Neil Gaiman that he was willing to pay $275,000 for this woman to sign an NDA than it does that this woman signed an NDA. But we'll get into more about why she would have signed the NDA. Oh no, my light. Okay. Continuity error, and I laughed during a serious video. They're gonna eat me alive on that snark Reddit one person made about me. I mean, if they remember to complain about anything other than me being fat. So, okay. Rachel Johnson tells us that Neil Gaiman is a free speech absolutist and that his use of NDAs conflicts both with that and with his positioning as like a male feminist. We get another position statement. When we asked about these apparent conflicts, we were told Neil Gaiman rejects any allegation of hypocrisy and that there's no public interest in this story which would expose Tortoise to legal risk. And then Paul says they do think that there is public interest in this story. So Paul is continuing here, and he says that the original allegations about abuse within a sexual relationship raised questions about whether Neil Gaiman could have had or should have had reasonable belief in consent for sex with vulnerable women. Again, as I said in my first video, they're framing the entirety of any sex with these women as being what the sexual assault was, rather than the specific instances of non-consensual sexual things being done to them, which are sexual assault, that were given within the story. Again, I just reject that framing, and I disliked that it was being brought up so early into this one, but I was still interested, especially since, it seemed they're mentioning that because this is a pretty clear difference between the relationship that Neil and Scarlett had or the relationship that Neil and Kay had, not least of which because Caroline and Neil are the same age. But in this position statement that we get told through Paul, it's, I don't know. It's interesting the way that he puts it. He smashes a bunch of words really close together to kind of make it seem like maybe Neil is saying something that he's not. And then also, once I look at the structure of the sentence for more than a couple seconds, I'm like, okay, maybe this is just poorly worded and not intentionally manipulative. I don't know. I want you to make your own, I would like you to make your own mind up about this one because I'm truly on the fence. With everything in mind, with how unclear it is where this position statement is coming from and how weird that feels, because I would prefer to be told, Neil's lawyer says this, Neil's publicist says this, or whatever. But the way he immediately mashes the position up with their read on it makes it feel muddy, because he says, all in one go, his position is that there was consent, but asking two women to sign NDAs suggests that he himself doesn't have much confidence in that position. So, technically both of those things are true, but the way that they're phrased just feels not like truthful framing. But then I also, other than just making a little bit more space in the sentence, I don't know how I would better phrase that. It truly might have just been poorly worded. But as I was listening to it, it sounded like it was saying the position is that there was consent, but that he knows signing the NDAs, you know what I mean? But that's not what was actually being said. It was like, this is Neil's position, comma, and also this other thing counteracts Neil's position. It just felt muddy. I already distrust whatever Neil Gaiman is saying. I just would like to know who he's saying it through, right? So to get into Caroline's allegations here, as I mentioned earlier, Caroline and Neil are the same age. They're both 63 years old. It's a departure from the pattern we saw in the first set of episodes, where they were significantly younger than him, these women that he was preying on. But this, of course, doesn't mean that there was no power imbalance in their relationship. I mean, the fact that it ended with a settlement payment and that he asked her to sign an NDA in the first place already implied to me that there was a pretty severe power imbalance even before we were told why she lived on his property. And I'm going to summarize that as well as some confusions that I had about the way that it was presented in the podcast. So Neil and Amanda originally were like renting a house near Caroline's studio because she is a ceramicist. And we're told that both Caroline and her husband and Neil and Amanda were looking to buy property. Like each set of couples was looking to buy a house. Neil bought this huge house in Woodstock, New York, because he had gotten a professor of the arts teaching gig at Bard College. Something I really don't like to think about, given how much access that would give him to, like, much younger women who likely had crushes on him and were, like, stoked to be in that classroom. I really hope he had better ethics there than he seems to have anywhere else in his life. He was going to start teaching in 2014, and Paul says around that time, Neil and Amanda were not around much and wanted somebody to watch over their property. And Caroline tells a story about being asked over dinner to move in and be caretakers on Neil and Amanda's estate. So then Caroline, her husband, and their 3 daughters moved into this house and had an agreement to do things like look after gardening and then also like pick up guests if Neil and Amanda had people staying at the house when they were away, go shopping so that the house was stocked. Rich people shit that I cannot imagine having somebody set up for, but okay. And Caroline says during her summary of the initial conversation where she was asked to do this job, they would pay for us to do stuff. But I'm actually uncertain if that actually ended up happening. So Paul doesn't mention a salary when they go over the list of jobs Caroline was obligated to do. He describes it, and I'm quoting here, but I might not be exact. Part of the deal was that they do odd jobs for Neil Gaiman and Amanda Palmer. In return, they get to live in the house, and Caroline can use an adjacent studio for her work. And over time, a 5-acre plot of the property for a reduced deal. It's hard work, but Caroline holds on to the hope of using that plot of land to build a house for her own family. So I'm not sure if there was also a salary on top of that, because it's kind of implied in what Caroline says, but then it's not implied in what Paul summarizes, right? 3 years in, Caroline and her husband separated, which this brings us to 2017, when Caroline says that Neil fired her ex-husband, quoting here, basically was like, I choose you, to Caroline. Paul tells us that Neil Gaiman's account is that he let Caroline's ex-husband go because he was an unreliable worker. Caroline and her 3 daughters stayed onto the estate after the ex-husband moved out, and Caroline says that Neil, took an interest and was very nice and kind to her, sending her texts, eventually asking her to take a sauna with him, and things became physical and escalated. She describes kind of similarly to what Scarlett described as, her hands being put on him without much discussion beforehand, he just kind of moves along with things. And she also says that she is embarrassed because she thought at first that maybe he liked her. She gets tearful and says she eventually asked him, what would Amanda say? And he said, about what? And she said, about this romance, to which he said, Caroline, there is no romance. And this was, the second or third time that they had been intimate, that he was, kind of making it clear that this was not a romantic thing, which is shitty. I mean, all of this is, I think, important to remember. All of this is happening under the context of him being her employer, and also, specifically her employer in a live-in position, which is actually, not that they seemed to have lived together in the house full time, but still, it is striking that that's similar to Scarlett, who also was, semi-live-in staff, right? So Paul tells us then that Caroline began to feel locked into a bargain, which to me does feel backed up in what Caroline says. She says that there were little hints that he would sometimes say, oh, we're going to need the house back, and she would be like, no, let's talk about it, let's figure it out, because she didn't have anywhere else to go, and he would essentially, come to the studio and have her perform oral sex on him. Paul points out Caroline is not alleging, physical force for the abuse, but that she felt it was coercive in light of her family and financial situation, and that she calls it sexual abuse. And Caroline very explicitly says, he can say it was consensual, but why would I do that, It was because I was scared of losing my place, It's all I had right then. So, not free, enthusiastic consent. This is financial coercion. This is bad. This is not good. You already know that. You don't need me to tell you that. But, this is bad. And, again, another example of him doing it with a woman who is in his employ, and especially following her divorce, like, she was very vulnerable. She speaks more about that in the episode. Her story also does have similarities with Kay and Scarlett when it comes to the kink stuff, too. She doesn't allege the exact same, like, level of extremities with physical violence or non-consent to that violence. It's more like similarities are more in regards to, like, wanting to be called master, which again is the title of the podcast series, which I still find a bit distasteful. We're told that this went on for 3 years, that she would say things like, "This is starting to feel really bad," and he would say, "I don't want you to feel bad." She says she feels guilty. She didn't say more to, like, stop things, but that she was terrified. We're told Neil was blaming him wanting the house back on Amanda, who wanted to use the studio that Caroline had been using for work. And Caroline says that whenever she would refuse Neil's sexual advances, he would say, Amanda really wants the house back, and grab her hand and say, "But you take care of me and I'll take care of you." Paul says Caroline understood this as a clear trade, where Caroline got to stay as long as she provided him with sex on demand. In the Neil Gaiman position, it describes, in the words of his account, the sex for rent position is a false and outrageous claim. Paul also says that the sexual messages and FaceTime calls that Caroline got from Neil after he left the Woodstock house are corroborated by 2 other women who we have spoken to and who do not speak in this episode because they spoke only to provide what they say was corroborating material. There is another woman who speaks later on in the episode, but these 2 women, as Paul just said, they don't come up in the episode. It does seem like they were reached out to by multiple people after they put out the initial batch of episodes. So all the stuff that I was saying about how, like, for now, at the time of recording, there were 2 accusers, now there are more. But I don't know to what level people are alleging what, right? But we don't know specifically what these other people are alleging, other than that they also got sexual messages and calls from Neil. I imagine probably there is, like, worse things than just that, but that's all that's confirmed. In the summer of 2021, Caroline stopped answering Neil Gaiman's phone calls, and she says that she was then given until December to leave the house. We're told Neil Gaiman's position is that it was always a possibility since she had been living there rent-free for the last 6 years, which didn't mention their work agreement, which again, I'm not sure if there was a salary for, or the handshake deal about eventually selling them part of the property on the house. Caroline was offered $5,000 at first and ended up settling with Neil for $275,000 and signing the NDA. We're told that before signing the NDA, she had already spoken to 2 of her friends about her allegations against Neil, and then after she signed the NDA, she didn't feel like she could because the NDA said that she couldn't. It technically prohibited her from speaking to family, friends, or colleagues, and, like, that is so lonely and disgusting and should not be allowed, and technically is not allowed if there is a crime. Like, you can't do an NDA about a crime. But people certainly try to, and people certainly take advantage of people not knowing what their rights are under the law. There is more discussion about this in the episode about NDAs and their legality or lack thereof when it comes to an actual crime occurring or being reported, and Caroline speaks to her reasoning for wanting to tell her story, saying that she is a mother of daughters the same age as Kay and Scarlett, and her wanting to use her name is part of that protective instinct that she feels over these other women and other potential victims, and also an attempt at pushing back against the shame. I think Caroline's story is on its face very plainly coercive on Neil Gaiman's part. It's yet another story told where even a generous reading of Neil does not leave him looking any good at all. Consent that is colored by financial coercion or housing instability that would be solved by doing a specific act, and you don't even actually have any assurance that once you do that act you are protected. That is not consent. It is not enthusiastic. It is not non-coerced. The whole arrangement being this, like, unspoken power dynamic here, where Gaiman absolutely would have had the upper hand by not cluing her in on, like, what the rules were and leaving her trying to make him happy in order to keep her housing. Again, he might say, oh, the claim of the sex for rent thing is ridiculous, but if that is how it was interpreted, because it only happened to come up that she would have to leave if they weren't having sex, that is still on him that was the inference that was coming across. in my opinion. This is a bad story. It is a bad look for Neil Gaiman and a terrible traumatic experience for Caroline to live through when she was trying to provide housing for herself and her 3 children. And it's also, I think, the story that is told the most competently in the Tortoise podcast. In a way, I'm glad that they hadn't heard from Caroline initially until they had already heard from other people, because I'm glad that she and her story did not become part of the main storyline. Her story being just one episode rather than being stretched out the way that the other women's were, I think lended to this episode being easier for me to get through. Rachel Johnson then comes back and says, as I mentioned earlier, Caroline was not the only person to reach out to them after their initial set of episodes was released, and she wasn't the only one willing to use her full name. So a woman named Julia Hobsbawm is introduced next, and she says that Neil Gaiman has been a friend of hers for over 40 years. Julia talks about meeting Neil Gaiman in the literary world when she was young and working as a publicist. She says that they used to hang out at parties, and she describes Neil making what she calls an aggressive, unwanted pass at me out of the blue that she has never experienced before or since. She says she said no, and he left. We're told Neil's account contrasts this. Again, we still don't know where that account came from. They make another attempt at showing 2 sides this way, though, and I think I'm just going to play you a clip this time to show you what I mean. Because, okay, so Julia says that she did not see Neil Gaiman again for another 20 years. She didn't want to see him, and she compartmentalized it once they reconnected 20 years later. At some point after they had been messaging, he invited her back to his place, essentially, and she said no, they just got coffee instead, and left it there. Julia and Neil never addressed that one incident of him making a pass at her, and it's not lost on me that that's also the same phrasing Scarlett used. She says she let it lie and that she regrets it. And Rachel then tells us that the way Julia feels is as though if she had come forward, Neil wouldn't have done this to so many other women. Maybe Rachel is summarizing something that Julia said off mic, but what Julia actually says is slightly different. Julia doesn't say that she herself has responsibility for Neil's actions towards other women. She does say she regrets enabling his celebrity reputation and that she wishes she had said to him at least once, hey, come on, what happened back then? I think the way Rachel presents this is very strange. Like I said, I'm using a clip for the first time in all of my describing this podcast to you. I'm showing you I'm just going to show you what I mean. This is what she says before Julia explains that.
They never speak of the incident again, but Julia always felt it was there, sitting between them. She now thinks that had she called him out on it at the time, in 1986, she could have stopped what could be described as a pattern of behaviour in its tracks. She says she is plagued by the incident to this day and worries that she enabled his alleged misconduct to continue.
And then just immediately after Julia's explanation, before what feels like a subject change to move on and wrap up the story, Rachel says, "It's a thought."
What I mind about is the fact that I perpetuated the myth that he built around himself, and his whole writing is about myths and fantasy. He built a myth around himself of looking like a gothic bad boy who was actually incredibly well-spoken and kind and gentle and generous and blah, blah, blah. I do wish that I had not enabled the celebrity part of him without having said to him at least once, hey, come on, what happened back then? I let it lie, and now I really regret that.
It's a thought.
Here's the thing. Obviously, this podcast wants more women to come forward and tell their stories about Neil Gaiman, and obviously telling your story is a good thing if that feels useful to you, and it can be helpful, and it also can kind of course correct someone's reputation if they've gotten away with something for a long time. But I really hate and feel uncomfortable with this framing where you have to say what happened to you so nothing will continue to happen. People continue to do things when they're already well known as a rapist. because it's not about the rapist's victims. It's not anything about the things that the victims have done or could do differently. It is about the rapist's actions. I just don't like the presentation here as if the actions of anybody other than the person who did the sexual assault are at all relevant to future sexual assaults that person would do. It's not really being challenged. It's a thought isn't a really good challenge, but Rachel Johnson can't say, of course, coming forward wouldn't have stopped this from happening to more women, because their theory, the way that they are justifying this podcast and all of its messy exploitation, is that by making this podcast, they will somehow stop Neil Gaiman from doing this to other women. And, I mean, it's probably the closest thing to anything that actually would. I understand the reasoning behind that. I understand the impulse and desire to make what might otherwise have been a whisper network something public, but I still do not like the way that this podcast does that. And this is a big reason why. The fact that it's so clear that they're kind of courting other stories. They're hoping more people will reach out to them. Women listening might feel less guilty and less motivated to reach out and tell Rachel their story and let her exploit it however she wants if they're told that nobody is under any obligation to disclose their trauma. So all she can actually say to try to dispel that idea is, it's a thought. Outside of that, and because it is kind of the closest thing that I have to a closing thought here, I have been reading this book by Catherine Angel called Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again, and it is fantastic. Somebody actually recommended it to me in the comment section of my last video about this whole Neil Gaiman situation. I'm 2/3 of the way through right now. I have not finished it just yet, but highly recommend. It is really, really relevant to a lot of things that we talk about very often on this channel with regards to consent, victim justice, stuff like that. It's fantastic. And there was this one part that was really striking to me that I really liked and that I would like to read now. In 2017, the dam broke on allegations against Harvey Weinstein. Subsequently, the Me Too hashtag, a slogan originated by Tarana Burke in 2006 to draw attention to sexual violence against young women of color, spread on social media, galvanizing women to tell their stories of sexual assault. Widespread media coverage ensued in the following months, largely about abuses of power in the workplace, and in this environment, the act of speaking out about one's experiences was taken as a self-evident and necessary good. I was glad of the coverage, and also dreaded it, having at times to rush to turn off the news and its relentless parade of grim stories. During hashtag MeToo's height, it sometimes felt that we women were required to tell our stories. The accumulation of stories online, on Facebook, on Twitter, as well as in person, created a sense of pressure, of expectation. When will you tell yours? It was hard not to notice the collective appetite for these stories, an appetite couched in the language of concern and outrage, one that fit neatly with the belief that speaking the truth is a foundational, axiomatic value for feminism. Hashtag MeToo not only valorized women's speech, but risked making it a duty, too, a mandatory display of one's feminist powers of self-realization, one's determination to refuse shame, and one's strength in speaking back to indignity. It also gratified a salacious hunger for stories of women's abuse and humiliation, though it did so selectively. When do we ask women to speak, and why? Who does this speaking serve? Who is asked to speak in the first place, and whose voices are listened to? Though any woman's allegation of sexual violence tends to encounter powerful resistance, wealthy white women's accounts were privileged during hashtag MeToo over those, for example, of young black women whose families had sought justice from musician and sexual abuser R. Kelly for decades. Studies show that black women reporting crimes of sexual violence are less likely to be believed than their white counterparts, with black girls seen as more adult-like and sexually knowing than their white peers, and that rape convictions relating to white victims lead to more serious outcomes than those relating to black women. Not all speech is equal. And yet it is not only in retrospect that women are urged to speak. It is also prospectively, into the future, protectively. Clear speech is a necessary ingredient for preventing future wrongs, not just addressing past ones. I just think that's a really good way of looking at it. a good way of kind of stopping and slowing down on a consumptive reaction to this kind of thing, and focusing instead on what kind of support that we would want to offer to people in our lives who may be going through similar things. What kind of things we can be thinking about to discourage these kinds of things from happening in society. You know, I just was discussing this in my video about the Melanie Martinez allegations and how people are really, really upset that Timothy Heller does not have the exact right date for their allegation. And I said in that one, why does it matter? Why would we be entitled to that date? Why were we entitled to Scarlett's WhatsApp history? Do we really need to frame it as if all of these women coming forward was such an imperative thing? Can't we praise people and thank them for telling their stories without turning it into something that's asking a bunch of other people to come forward? And of course, it is fine and good when the rest of the people do come forward and feel empowered to, but I am very concerned about what happens when coming forward comes not from a place of empowerment, but from a place of pressure. We do not treat victims well when they behave imperfectly, and people behave imperfectly all the time when they are traumatized and hurt. What this results in is public-facing victims being people who are very easy to demonize, very easy to find one excuse to stop believing them, to stop liking them. And not really the same thing, but, you know, I can't mention Angelina Jolie and the fact that I take her side over Brad Pitt's in their divorce and his proceedings against her that seem to me to be legal abuse without people commenting to say, well, Angelina Jolie hasn't been perfect. Nobody has been perfect when they have been abused. Nobody has been perfect even when they've not been abused, but especially when you have just been through trauma. Like, I have different standards. I think it's fine to adjust your standards in a way that is empathy-based. And obviously, as you have noticed from my channel, my empathy runs out when people are kind of grifting or selling out or whatever. But when you just are being a victim, I don't require more from that of you. I don't require you to tell me everything in specific detail. I don't require you to come forward to some kind of noise organization, even if the person who abused you is famous. If you don't want to, it's fine not to. You're allowed to refer to yourself as a survivor without having to tell a story that the telling is going to traumatize you all the more for. Like I said before, I'm really, really enjoying Tomorrow Sex Will Be Good Again. I'm sure I will have finished it by the time I upload my next video. I just wanted to get this one out there. And I do know that and also the subject of using kink as an excuse is going to come up in the upcoming Armie Hammer video. That one is going to be long and is taking me a while to compile, but I'm working on it, and thank you very much to everybody who voted in that poll. If you'd also like to be in the loop about upcoming content, I have a community tab that I am pretty active on if you would like to subscribe to me. I also, I don't actually think that it hurts me very much for now in the algorithm that I don't censor things or use cutesy words, but in case it does and you want to make sure that you don't miss future videos from me, I would greatly appreciate it if you would consider subscribing to me. I try to upload about once a week. I also have a Patreon if you're interested in additional videos from me every month. I've been aiming for 2 a month. I have one coming out for the Patreon shortly. I also have a Ko-fi and a GoFundMe situation going on that you can read more about in the description. Thank you so much to everybody who has supported me on Patreon, to everybody who has supported me on Ko-fi, and especially to everybody who has helped with this GoFundMe with my housing emergency. Really beyond any expectation that I ever had when I shared that, and thank you very, very much. I was panicking, and you helped me to stabilize my housing, and it is still an uphill battle, and one that I'm hoping that being monetized on YouTube is going to help with, but I really, really appreciate so much the help that I've gotten from this. And also, if you are not financially comfortable to support me, don't, please. I very much am, like, I'm asking for people who would like to give me money to give me money. I assume most everybody normal is not off-put by the fact that I ask for money, because, like, if I was a larger channel, this is just where a sponsorship read would be, right? But, you know, again, you think about things differently once somebody makes a snark subreddit about you, I guess. Thank you so much for watching. Again, thank you to everybody who has supported my channel, my videos, my well-being. I love you very, very much, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.